Good afternoon. I'm Pete Pellegrino, professor here with the Wargaming Department at the U.S. Naval War College. I'm a retired naval flight officer and a former game division director here at the college from 2004 to 2007. The electives I used to teach were the Wargaming elective and now the Game Theory elective. And so based on my experience in teaching those classes, we're going to go through a series of lectures here. They're all part of the professional development course for new faculty members joining the Wargaming Department. And the first one is called Game Design 100A, which is basically trying to address the question of what is a game. There's joint language that talks to gaming definition. Joint Pub 1, which has a definition of a simulation, by whatever means, of a military operation involving two or more opposing forces using rules, data, and procedures designed to depict an actual or assumed real-life situation. I want to draw your attention to the underlined parts, by the way, in all these things. And in Joint Pub 1, that sense of two or more opposing forces is important. The Perla quote that you see there is Peter Perla. Peter is a game designer, author of The Art of Wargaming, and he's currently at the Center for Naval Analyses. And you see there his definition of a war game is that model or simulation that does not involve the operation of actual forces, in which the flow of events is affected by decisions made over the course of that play by players representing the opposing sides. Other definitions that you'll run across, McHugh, that's Frank McHugh. Frank McHugh joined the Wargaming Department in the 1930s, was in here for over 3 decades. And also wrote a book on wargaming. The Fundamentals of Wargaming is his book. Frank McHugh's definition there is a simulation of selected aspects of a military operation in accordance with those predetermined rules, data, and procedures. And again, you see those key phrases that keep reappearing about decision-making there in the McHugh one. And lastly there, that's Callan, that's Dennis Callan, who is a former analyst with our O&I debt here, our Navy intelligence debt. And that was his definition that he came up with, the creation of a moving context within which the player is required to make decisions for the purpose of having a worthwhile conversation and gaining insight on tactical, operational, strategic issues. But throughout all of these, you keep seeing the same phrases being underlined: decision-making, conflict, opposing sides, and that's why we have kind of the wrap-up of the essence of a game is people. So it's got to be a people-centric activity here, making decisions in the context of competition or conflict, either with themselves or other people or their environment. And this kind of definition of gaming is specific to the Wargaming Department here at the college in that it shapes how we do our games. And these briefs of the whole game design series, a 100 through 300 series, are really focused at gaming the way we do it here at the college. And that's a slightly different kind of gaming than you'll find perhaps at NDU, at some of the other institutes, and particularly as you'll find in the commercial field. There is a lot of overlap with the commercial world and how they design board games. Hasbro, we did a little sharing. Hasbro and the Wargaming Department got together a couple of years ago with the idea of, I'll show you how we think about games and how we design them. You show us yours, I'll show us mine, type of thing. And the Hasbro game design folks were very taken by how much what we do as far as the intellectual process of thinking about a game and how to bring it to market, if you will, is the same as theirs. So there's a lot of crossover between the commercial world of board gaming and gaming design and what we do here, realizing that ultimately what we do here, though, is driving towards that decision-making experience for our players or gaining decision-making information. So keep in mind that whole sense of people, decisions, and the environment part, because later we'll talk about what isn't a game. You'll start to see why we don't really consider some of these other things games. Now, part of understanding a game is understanding what it is or isn't used for. And this is what we kind of call the good, the bad, and the ugly of wargaming. The good for wargaming, given that we're talking about people making decisions in that conflict environment, is that it's great for investigating process, how people make decisions under certain circumstances. It's good for organizing ideas. We can have activities where we call these what events, when you're trying to understand how different ideas relate and can be classified and grouped together to understand the larger picture. Wargaming is a good approach to that. Same thing with just trying to explore issues and kind of dig at things that might not otherwise be apparent as actually being a problem. And that kind of ties in with identifying implications and coming up with questions. So those are all nice, soft, subjective goals, that gaming is good at exploring because of the people nature of it. That very part of it, the people part, is what makes wargaming not good for calculating outcome. Some people want to use a war game to say the war game showed that 22% of the time these forces will be engaged and destroyed. War games are not good from that type of perspective because often the probabilities that drove those outcomes were inputs to the game in the first place. Someone had to put in a PK. Someone had to come up with the statistics and probabilities to support gameplay. So then saying that gameplay proved that the probability and statistics were correct is a circular argument, and we try to avoid that at all costs. The whole idea of proving or predicting. Games aren't experiments. Even if you say, well, we're going to run the game a couple of different 3 times, and all we're going to do is we're going to change the order of battle and see how it works. Humans make terrible constants. So as soon as you played the game once, you're a different person. I can't somehow reset your head and make you forget everything you've learned about the first time you played the game, thinking that the only difference now is that I gave you a different order of battle or I changed the opponent. And therefore the game proves that, oh, without the death ray, you lose. With the death ray, you win. Producing numbers is another thing that we don't like to try to use war games for, because that's trying to pull quantitative data out of what is otherwise a qualitative experience. The worst thing war game will be used for, I call it the ugly, is when war games are really hiding logic fallacies, like the false choice, where the war game tries to set up a situation where clearly option A was not good. Therefore, option B must be the right answer. An example is this was a war game that was played trying to show the worth of a theater ballistic missile defense system from a land-based perspective, where the players were a group of reporters brought in to play a game. In the course of playing the game and trying to defend the west coast of the United States from missile attacks, 1 or 2 cities, they failed to stop, intercept the incoming missile, and San Francisco is destroyed. And then the game organizers turn to the reporters and say, see, with this system, you lost 1 city. Imagine what you would have lost without it. The takeaway is supposed to be, oh, therefore, it's either have this system and save the West Coast, or not have this system and lose everything. It's a false choice. That isn't necessarily only 2 possible outcomes, but the game was set up to reinforce the outcome of, therefore, it is a good system, fund my system, Rice Bowl protectionism, and we'll see that in certain games. And this is where games are probably at their worst, in that they're being misused to convey self-fulfilling prophecy or advocacy. Part of the problem with talking about games, though, is that we don't have a common lexicon or terminology to do it. And this will cause problems when you're trying to work with other services or other organizations that have wargaming as kind of part of their business model, if you will. So while there's no accepted standard terminology for games, there are some stuff that it's more or less accepted through common usage. One of the things we try to avoid, though, is using any term in a war game that does not mean it's the exact same thing in the joint world. So if there is a joint term and it has a joint definition, do yourself a favor and don't try to use that same word to mean something different in a war game. Saying, well, in this circumstance, it doesn't mean that, it means this. Because in joint gaming, you'll just confuse participants with mixing apples and oranges, or apples and apples, but only trying to call your apple an orange. Terms that you'll hear routinely used on our slide here, you'll see the idea about sides, players, teams, and cells. People will use this interchangeably. They'll talk about a multi-sided game, a multi-cell game. They talk about the players. We're talking about the participants, no matter how they're broken up or divided. And most common here at the college, you'll hear them referred to as either sides or cells. The cell colors are somewhat standardized in that if we're talking about blue cell, red cell, etc., blue is usually always friendly forces, own forces. Red is always the enemy. Orange are those forces aligned with red. Green are those forces aligned with blue. Yellow tend to be kind of neutrals involved in the fight. And occasionally you hear something referred to as pink. Pink are players performing a red role, an adversarial role, but they're somewhat co-opted or under the control of white. And white usually always refers to the control cell and those entities represented by the control cell. So I take some red, I mix it with some white, and I get pink. So we'll see that later when we talk about multi-sided gaming and the role of pink in a war game and how that's slightly different than having a free-playing red. Other terms that tend to get kind of slopped together: assessment, adjudication, and evaluation. What has come for some to be a difference is adjudication is simply saying what happened. A shot at B, what happened? B was destroyed. Why it happened is the assessment portion. So it's a nuance. Here at the college we don't quite focus on that nuance as much as, for example, the Army does. They tend to make much more of a distinction between if you're in the adjudication cell versus being in the assessment cell. Here we'll just tell you you're probably in assessment. We tend to use the phrases interchangeably. Just be aware of that if you're dealing with external entities, that some do see a specific difference in that. Who we're doing the game for is typically referred to as a sponsor. Sometimes you hear them referred to as clients. Stakeholders are not the sponsor, but there are other organizations that have a vested interest in the game. So, stakeholders. Often the sponsor, though, isn't actually physically present. I mean, if the sponsor is the Chief of Naval Operations, he won't be hanging out, acting in that capacity. His office will be, and somebody is assigned to be his executive agent or representative, and that's the executive agent term. So that's just some of the terminology that you'll hear right off the bat as people start talking about games that are coming up and games in development. And again, how many sides, how many cells, who's in white, what's the client want, what's the sponsor's interest, etc. Now, the word game itself does not have a unified definition. And in usage, what you'll hear are some things that people will refer to as a war game that may or may not actually be a game. People, conflict, decisions, environment. And the first one I'll talk about is seminar. You'll hear this quite a bit. A seminar or seminar games. And those terms, we'll talk about those again later, are not interchangeable. By Pete Pellegrino definition, and I just made this up, a seminar is an event with the primary goal of presenting, exchanging, discussing, or gaining information. It's a sharing information activity. Okay? Distinguish that from a workshop, and the key word in workshop is work. Okay? A workshop is similar to the seminar, but the big difference is something needs to be produced. By the end of the workshop, the participants will have produced a prioritized list, a way ahead. They'll have had to have made something to make it a workshop. An exercise, and this does have some overlap with other definitions in terms of the key word here, exercise. An activity designed to rehearse or practice. You exercise something, you rehearse it, you practice it, with actual forces or assigned staff. And usually you're trying to work out or trying to give the staff practice with a specific set of procedures. So when we talk about either field exercises, command post exercises, CPXs, FTXs, or tabletop exercises, we really are trying to give the actual people who would have to do it for real practice in doing it, whatever it is. So think about how often we'll have a war game where we're bringing in representatives. We've got multiple staffs combined. We're not trying to exercise the 7th Fleet staff in the execution of a particular op-ord. We're actually trying to get operational representatives from multiple staffs together to think about a problem. See, already we're off the exercise definition. But you'll hear people use these interchangeably. That, well, we're doing a seminar, well, we're going to call it a war game. You know, hear that, and we're just as guilty here in that what we're really doing is bringing together a group of individuals from different, perhaps, backgrounds to talk about and share ideas. We'll call it a game when there's really no competition, no conflict, but they're sharing information. Not that not good things aren't coming out of it, but it's really not a game. A term you'll hear thrown around here is bogsat. Bunch of guys sitting around a table. Bogsat. It's used somewhat pejoratively to imply that the activity could be much more, but it's just a bogsat. And again, not that events that we run here of that nature do not have value. They're just simply not really war games. Those are things that kind of are borderline in terms of, well, you might use some gaming techniques as part of your seminar. You may have, as part of your workshop, an embedded activity that uses some gaming approaches. But when we get into things that are really not games, experiments are not games. Games are not experiments. An experiment from a scientific perspective uses the scientific approach in hypothesis identification, data collection, comparison of results against expected, reinvestigation. It requires the identification of independent and dependent variables and constants. Games have precious few constants because it is a human event. And again, if you keep falling back to that original definition and thinking about games are being about humans making decisions in an environment of conflict, you can see where it would be very difficult to try to set controls and to distinguish, well, what's the variable, what's the independent variable, what's the dependent variable. It just doesn't fit. Models and simulations are the one area where you can get into some fairly heated debates with your colleagues in the M&S world about is or isn't it a game. And you can argue that, well, a model is meant to be a static representation of a thing or process, typically a miniature. A simulation is putting a model interacting with an environment or another model. Now I have a simulation. But again, those are helpful tools to use during a game, but it's not the game themselves. You can have a very elaborate simulation for air-to-air warfare, but it doesn't mean there's a game there unless, again, there's a human involved somehow making decisions about those conflicts, and that it's then being, the environment he's making those decisions in is being changed by those models interacting in a simulation. But by themselves, it is not a game. If you get involved with the Connections conferences, where you'll have a lot of the M&S industry represented, and there is you'll get a sense that the M&S crowd pretty much so sees their software as the game, where we'd argue, no, your software is a tool that supports a game. But if I take the humans out, I don't have anything that, at least here at the college, we're terribly interested in. Other areas, ops analysis and operational research, integration definition, if you're familiar with IDEF, IDEF 0, and the DODAF architecture, the DoD architectural framework, that uses the OVs, operational views, 1, 2, 3, SVs. Those are potentially good tools to help you design games, but in and of themselves really aren't games. But again, because games have a certain amount of panache, people like to say they had a game to evaluate something. That seems to give it more gravitas, more credence. They'll often call games things that are clearly not, from at least our perspective, a true game. Now, if you start talking about games, you have to start talking about game theory, because people will ask, well, isn't that the same thing? Game theory is a specific field of applied mathematics, typically to the social sciences, most often used in economics, to help people understand behaviors and why they pick a particular choice given the impact of choices of others. If A picks this, then B picks that. Why did B make that choice given that A made that previous choice? Classic example of Prisoner's Dilemma. The use of game theory, and we used to teach a elective here on game theory, is handy in times to make sure that the decisions you have players making are what we call hard decisions. And as a separate lecture, we talk about just what does that mean. I say, well, make it hard. What does hard mean? Part of checking to see that a decision is hard is using a bit of game theory to see how one player might make a choice given payoffs, that he would receive given that another player makes a choice. Now, if I make those choices such that the payoffs are very similar, that's a harder decision than when it's clearly, oh, well, it's 100 or I get 1. I don't have to think too hard about which one I'm going to pick. I'm going to pick the payoff that gives me 100 points over the one that gives me 1. Yeah, but if I start to bring those together and I start making other potential downsides to making those choices, then I might be challenging you more to think harder about the decision. And now I'm moving into an area that I'm interested in from a gaming perspective because I'm making your choices hard. And game theory can be used to kind of help understand or support that. An example, and this is self-promotion, of a card game based almost 100% on game theory is called Anaconda. And it's a Civil War game that you can download at juniorgeneral.org. And it is pure game theory. I was teaching the game theory course at the time and wanted to make a card game to illustrate game theory, so that was the design impetus behind that game. And again, game theory, handy tool for helping us to understand how to build good features into wargaming, is not wargaming in and of itself. Part of when we talked about what makes war games bad or what war games are bad for were certain terms that around here will get the teeth sucking and the eye rolling and people shaking their heads if you use them. And it's in terms of predict, prove, or validate. War games do not predict the future. They do not prove theory. They do not validate someone's concept. Other activities may help do that downstream as you get into later parts of development. But the wargaming part of any type of activity that's part of a concept development cycle, for example, a wargame will not predict, prove, or validate anything because of its non-repeatability, because it's a shoved activity. We often use the joke that, okay, so great. So what we found out is that by running this war game at the War College on a Tuesday in November with these 6 people, all of whom were crabby because there was no coffee left after the break, and you're going to take that outcome as somehow validating your idea. And it's built on that much of a subjective ground. So anytime we hear sponsors come to us saying, well, I want a war game to validate something, we already start doing the backpedaling, saying, well, we cannot validate it. We can help investigate it. We can help see if there's any types of problems inherent with the concept, if there are other issues, but we're not going to let you walk away from here with a stamp of approval on the cover of a game report that says the U.S. Naval War College validated the idea, because war games simply do not do that. If that's what they don't do, then what can we use them for? And we kind of touched on those earlier on in our good, bad, and ugly comparisons. Games are great for education. Games give decision makers decision-making practice. And then I can put you in an environment, expose you to a bunch of conditions, and give you the opportunity to practice the process of making a decision. So decision-making practice is a big use for gaming. We also can, by the fact that I bring together multiple people, start building consensus in that it's a shared experience. You all got to kind of kick around an idea, and collectively you all start to begin to understand its strengths and weaknesses. It is a far more powerful way to get a group of people to begin to understand collectively an idea than it was if I had shotgunned out 12 concept papers and had everyone read it sitting in their cubicles, as opposed to bringing you together into a room and having you play a game based on that concept. It'll let you start getting into the idea of assessing alternatives, because gaming is a free way to do what-if type stuff. You do risk-taking. You said no one bleeds, no one dies in McCarty Little Hall during a war game. So you should be encouraged to push the envelope. You should be encouraged to try out some stuff that which you would otherwise not consider in the field if you actually had equipment and men at risk. We want people to fail at war games. We find that people who lose at a war game walk away with a far better appreciation, with much more introspective, and a much better understanding than people who win. You joke, winners go to the bar. Losers sit there and they cry in the cell and try to figure out, why did we lose? Winners seldom ask, why did we win? Winning is sufficient. Losers want to know why they lost. So we try to set up situations that are hard. We want to drive you into impossible corners, and we want you to lose every now and then, because again, you'll get more out of it that way. The Global 09 war game run last summer, Blue got pounded. Blue got much more out of it than Red. And of course we weren't really interested in training Red, but Blue came away with a situation that he did not realize was that difficult, caused Blue to reconsider the value of certain rear area defense, logistics concepts, cyber warfare, all things that had he been easy to brush aside Red, he would never have been exposed to it and wouldn't have had those same takeaways. So despite his staff getting beat up, he still thought it was a fantastic experience, he being the flag officer who was leading the Blue Forces. We can use wargaming in part to kind of just give things a run through, but realize that just because you ran through it once and it turned out good doesn't mean that that wasn't the 1% success end of a distribution curve, and if I had run it another 99 times you would have failed. But it does give an opportunity for staffs to kind of, again, get in there, kick the tires, knock around an idea, practice something in a relatively low-risk environment. We also like to say that gaming basically reduces surprises. One of the things you'll hear from sponsors sometimes, or particularly players when a game starts, is, this isn't plausible. This isn't real. This is unrealistic. Remembering, though, that we all have a personal metric of real. What we're really saying is, this does not fit my past expectations or experience. So this is the whole joke about junior officers in terms of when the ensign says, well, in my experience, versus the captain saying in my experience, we would think that the ensign has a much narrower field of what my experience represents than the captain does. So when players say that's not realistic, what they're saying is it's outside of my expectation or experience. Doesn't mean it's not possible. And war games help start to expand what is in the realm of the possible that you need to consider. So the next time this pops up, it perhaps won't be as much of a surprise as the first time it did. And again, you'd rather have it pop up in a war game than pop up on the battlefield. There's a variety of folks who we kind of refer to here as far as, I don't want necessarily icons of wargaming, but people who make contributions to the field. McCarty Little brought wargaming here, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in the history section. But McCarty Little's points about what good is a war game is the idea that it makes better plans and planners. You get practice actually doing the process of planning when you have to do it within a war game. Allows you to demonstrate concepts. By practice, you get better, quicker, faster at making decisions. And because we're not bound necessarily by the limitations of physics, we can explore a much wider range of activity than we could in McCarty Little's day, where prior to wargaming, everything was get underway. So you wanted to investigate a tactic, you got underway. With McCarty Little's introduction of wargaming to the War College, now we didn't have to put ships at sea. We didn't have to go to that expense and time. We could learn just as valuable lessons using little tiny ships on the tabletop. Ken Watman was the chairman here of wargaming from 2001 to 2004. And Dr. Watman's perspectives was that wargaming was a critical part of the analytic process. There's a lot of things you have to go through, from I have a good idea and I'm at the whiteboard till we have fielded equipment and tactics and procedures to go with that fielded equipment. A lot of things have to happen. Wargaming ought to be one of the things that happen, but wargaming should not be the sole analytic tool we use. It should be one of many. It should be run many times, and that will help reduce the cost of ultimately fielding it and potentially putting forward a more capable system. Peter Pearl, I mentioned him earlier, again, author of The Art of Wargaming. Peter likes to describe wargaming as being a very powerful learning tool, and that it's what he refers to as story living. Because if you get immersed in a good game, you're drawn in. You are sucked into that game in a way that other types of activities don't necessarily engage you. We've had games here where we've had players who were kept playing, so to speak, after the game was over. So we would have a move. We'd adjudicate the move. The players would take a break and go to lunch, and you'd hear them in the hallway still fighting the fight, so to speak, because for them, it's living that story. As far as they were concerned, it really happened. They're as emotionally invested in trying to win the game as if they had actually been attacked. And again, it's part of the emotional power of games, and games as a story that just draws you in and makes you live it, as opposed to kind of remaining outside of it as an observer. So games are very powerful learning tools. We can use them to help organize our information and understanding, kind of getting an understanding of how information relates. We can use them for explaining events. And basically what we're trying to do there is understand the how and why. Why do things unfold the way they do? Why do things interact in the way they do? And exploring, which is the big piece of trying to figure out what I didn't know. This is what we call it. We didn't know what we didn't know. Gaming gives you a chance to explore, to kind of flip over rocks and to understand or be exposed to things that you didn't otherwise think were a problem. An example, we did a war game here for CENTCOM and Fifth Fleet, and looking at their operations in their AOR, and bringing in players and experts that represented the other countries in the region. And there were things that Fifth Fleet had assumed that by doing would be good things from a de-escalatory perspective. If there were tensions in the region, then these types of operations would help tamp down tensions. In the course of the game, they did the exact opposite. And bringing in those players, some of the players were actually saying, no, if you were to do that, you would simply heighten tension in the region. And right away, there was this, oh, no, that's not the way it would go. And the experts were saying, no, actually, it would be, and here's why. So Fifth Fleet was getting exposed to a set of criteria and circumstances and conditions that they had not thought of when the plans were put together. Gaming is a great way, to, again, to bring people together in a non-threatening environment to be able to find those kinds of discoveries. one of the ways when we talk about what is a game, you'll hear people describe games in certain terms. And they'll use stuff like its purpose. We have educational games versus analytic games. They'll talk about its scope and level, meaning basically tactical, operational, strategic. How many sides in a game? What's a multi-sided game? Is a single-sided game? The amount of information, and what they're really talking about there is what we call open or closed intelligence, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. How it's evaluated, what's the assessment process, and here you'll hear the terms free, rigid, or semi-rigid. The techniques required or used for the simulation part of it, because usually someplace in a game there's going to be some measure of simulation. Not necessarily computer simulation, just might be using charts to work out that if this many submarines attack this many ships, the outcome is a 0.8. Something will be used to represent or to simulate some of the tactical level force-on-force pieces. And there's other attributes that you hear people talk about in terms of time format for games, whether it's a seminar game or not, or an operational game. And we'll talk about these here to follow. But the important takeaway at this point is that just because you can describe a game doesn't mean you can design a game. And this was a problem I had when I first joined the department, was that people kept talking about game design, and I kept hearing things like, well, it's an open, multi-sided game with rigid assessment using move steps. Okay, but I still don't know how to design a game. You've described one for me, and the analogy we use is I can describe a house, doesn't make me an architect. I can describe a painting, doesn't make me an artist. So while the language is handy for defining a game, it doesn't necessarily help you understand the design process behind it. So when we talk about the purpose of a game, we're typically talking about those two broad categories, the educational games or the analytic games. And educational games are designed to give players decision-making practice. That's kind of its core activity, is we want them to get that opportunity under a certain set of conditions to make decisions under the pressure of a war game. Contrast that with analytic games, where what we're trying to do is obtain decision-making information, not necessarily for those players, but for the future. So we're running a war game to better understand the Pakistan-Indian conflict. We're running a war game to gather data to better understand the requirements of the medical community in maintaining force readiness in a conflict in the Koreas. Those are games for slightly different purposes. It does influence in how you design the game, and it's important to understand what you're doing. And it's not always clear-cut. It's not just purely education or purely analytic. But that's one of the ways we differentiate games, is from its purpose. The level that we're playing as well. Here at the War College, we tend to do operational level war, operational and some strategic. Once upon a time, particularly before World War II, we did much more tactical level gaming, where we were very interested in, if this frigate encounters this destroyer, what's the best maneuver, concentration of force and time, firepower, outcome of the conflict, and we're using it as a teaching tool, because that's what the part of the Naval War College's mission was. We don't do nearly as much tactical gaming here now. It's primarily focused at the operational to strategic level. But it's important to understand when you're in a game design perspective, when you're trying to put together a game, is what's that target? Because I can't have it all. I can't have high fidelity tactical play. At the same time, I'm trying to run operational level of war and strategic considerations, because the game would be massive. They have to deal with very different levels of detail, very different time horizons, and it would be very difficult to game all that simultaneously. There is a later lecture in the 300 series where we start talking about gaming simultaneously various levels of war. But by and large here, we tend to focus on the operational level. There's something that's called the Player's Cross, which diagrammatically tries to help you understand the relationships between the players, subordinates, which are probably simulated, superiors, which may or may not be players, often are simulated as well, in the design role. And that's a later lecture as well. One thing that gets talked a lot around here is what was called one-sided versus two-sided gaming. We used to do a lot of two-sided gaming. Then we slid into more one-sided gaming, which quite frankly, from my perspective, isn't much of a game. Solitaire, it's a game, it's one-sided, and it's rather boring. Okay? Go back to that initial definition of the essence of gaming is people making decisions in conflict. Now true, you can be in conflict with yourself. That is a conflict scenario, which tends to be what one-sided gaming is about. But it's far more interesting to have an adversary. So Whether you use two sides or what we'll call 1.5-sided game, it kind of depends on what the objective of the event is. If it's more important that red, the adversarial force, be able to interact in the environment in a very dynamic, free-playing way, you want them free. You want a two-sided game. Let red play to win. If, on the other hand, because if you have a much narrower set of objectives and you need to investigate one particular part of a problem, you may not be able to let red play freely because red may drag this off in a direction, while interesting, isn't what's under investigation. So you may need to constrain the adversarial team in some fashion. This is what we call basically 1.5-sided games, where the adversarial forces have been kind of folded in with a control group. So it's blue versus this control entity, not blue versus red with control kind of acting as an umpire. 1.5-sided games you can often tell because they're what we call measle driven. Measles are injects. Measles stands for the major significant events list, or master significant events list. Events being things that you're going to, at a given time, squirt into the problem. The envelope that gets handed to the players at time 2-4. The report that comes in that's been pre-scripted that the ship is under attack. Those sorts of things are needed because you don't have a red team creating the conflict. So you've got these injects that are driving along, and the injects are usually very specifically defined because they're put in for a purpose to stimulate some part of the game to see what reaction decisions get made. So if you hear injects, they're probably talking about what's called the 1.5-sided game because there's only half an opponent, if you will, because it's somewhat under control of the white self-control. One of the other descriptors we talked about in the intro to this section was information, and whether it's open or closed. Open assessment, or I'm sorry, open information is a game where you see everything there is to be seen. There's no hidden information. You have a perfect picture of the world. Chess is a classic example. There's no extra hidden pieces. There's nothing that's not there on the board visible to both players. You have perfect situational awareness, the disposition of forces in chess. It's open intelligence. Closed intelligence implies that there's some limiting factor that keeps you from having perfect situational awareness, the disposition of forces or what's going on. Poker is a closed game. You know that your player has so many cards. You know that certain cards have been played so far, but you do not know with the certainty that you do in chess as to what exactly is in your opponent's hand. So anytime we start to limit the information to some extent, we're moving into more of a closed intelligence game. And both are used, again, depends on the objective, which intelligence system you use, open or closed, that best suits the objectives. But again, that's another phrasal here, is this idea of open or closed intelligence. Assessment, adjudication. What we're talking about here is how we're going to determine the outcome of the player-on-player interaction. Rigid games are basically rule-driven games. The rule says, the table says, if A does this to B, the outcome is 7. That's it. That's the answer, 7. Okay, think about most games that you pick up off the shelf at your local toy store are rigidly assessed games. There's no umpire. It's just the rules are the rules, and that's where the game goes, and that's the outcome. Just read the back of the game box. Those are rigidly assessed. You may be using a computer to help do that rigid assessment. All you've done is just move the rule set and moved all the tables, moved all the math into the electronic box as opposed to looking at manually. But again, the outcomes are being determined by a very specific set of rules. Contrast that with free assessment. Free assessment is basically where you've got subject matter experts, umpires, who just sit there and go, well, he did that, he shot that, he did that. I give him credit for, make it 50%. Roll the dice. Or just say, go ahead and sink the ship. I think he should have credit for taking out that target. You're solely relying on the expertise of experts who, through their experience, can render a quick decision. Speed is one of the big advantages to freely assessed games. However, they are more subjective than the rigid ones. That makes them no less valid, because understand that even when we talk about rigidly assessed games, what are we relying on? We're relying on probabilities, we're relying on algorithms that somebody had to write. So even then, there is a human element to it. What we tend to use a lot around here at the college is what's called semi-rigid or semi-free. And essentially what you're doing is you're using models like lookup tables, like probability outcome tables, combat result tables. But they're being tempered by an umpire's experience. What we don't want to necessarily have happen in a game is have that 1% solution pop out of the combat result table. 99 times out of 100, if that were to happen, everybody would go left. However, if that one time you roll the dice, you get that one oddball result that says we go the opposite direction, the control team has to step back and say, okay, but what does that do to the overall game? That may be a time where the umpire is going to step in and say, okay, got it, I know what the computer said, but for the purpose of this game, I want to go this way. Some people say that's being dishonest, that somehow you ignored what the computer said, and therefore your whole game is now off the track. What we always do here is we will capture all those in our game report. We do not try to hide anything in our gaming. The College Wargaming Department takes very seriously capturing in our after-action reports everything that happened. It's understanding why it happened and adding that extra layer of understanding that makes it better than a hot wash. I mean, we're big on doing more detailed analysis than doing a real quick, hey, this is what happened and we're done. We're trying to understand why it happened, and we want to document all those oddball things. Because it may be that in real life, that's the oddball event that occurs. Every now and then, those 1%ers do happen. But since we're trying to explore a particular problem, that may not have been the best way to use the gamer's time in the opportunity we had for the event we were running. And so we may vary the outcome slightly. But we will capture that. We're not going to hide that. And so that's kind of how we feel okay using that approach. The way we simulate lower forces, because that's typically the part that gets simulated. Right? If we're playing the operational level of war, we're going to simulate all the tactical level of force. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we can use computer models, and we have a couple here at the college that we'll use. Or we can just use pins stuck on a map and just use lookup tables, use subject matter experts to simulate those forces. Again, which technique you use will be determined by limitations in time, the applicability of the software to the given problem. It's all something that we're going to consider as a conscious design choice as to whether or not we're going to rely on a JSAF, the Joint Semi-Automated Forces simulation software, for example, or whether just a quick lookup table will suffice for the purposes of the game. No one is inherently better or more correct than the other. It depends on the game we're playing. Time is probably one of the most hardest concepts to deal with in a game. Humans are hardwired to run at 1-to-1. I cannot make you work faster. I cannot make you think faster. I cannot make time pass for you faster. You're stuck at living time at a 1-to-1 scale. Unfortunately, that means we'd have to play every game at a tactical level. So how do we accelerate time in a way that's not disorienting to the players? And that's part of when we talk about move step games versus running games. A move step game has a specific time frame set for a given move. This move represents 3 days. As opposed to running time, where basically, and we used to do large games here, the original Global War Game series here was a running game scenario where the clock was running. Just a minute was a minute. So we were playing real time, the operational level, in a very large distributed war game. Now we tend to play more move step games than we do running time games, simply because of some of the processes we're trying to investigate take weeks or months to evolve. So if I'm playing a real-time game and I'm only playing a week at Newport, then I only get 3 days into the problem, which may not be very useful for the processors that are under investigation. So how time will jump and how you manage that. It's easy to say, okay, we're just going to make every move step be 4 days. But how the players can deal with that is something that the designer has to be very aware of. Inductive versus deductive gaming is another term that kind of gets thrown around here that is a little hard to grasp. Essentially, when we talk about an inductive game, we're talking about a game that, as we say, it goes where it goes. And I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm happy to go there. It's easier to see in its contrast. A deductive game has to follow along a certain timeline and path to be able to get to the game's objective. The classic example of deductive gaming is when you're doing multi-phase war. If you're doing a game where you're going to do a forcible entry phase, followed by a power projection that forces ashore into stabilization. The problem with this game is, what if during the forcible entry phase you get stuck? You find out that, hey, the whole plan of the Navy being able to put the Marines and the Army on the beach in the first 48 hours was badly misconceived, given what Red did. And now the Navy forces are stuck in the littorals dealing with an ASW, shallow water ASW, and mine problem. Meanwhile, tick-tock, all the other players who came, like the Army, waiting for the forces to land so their part of the game could go on, are getting bored. We're watching the Navy flounder around with this forcible access problem. When does our part of the game come? This is a game that has to be driven along deductively. We've got to have each part linked to the next in a logical sequence, otherwise we're not going to get to all the parts. Inductive gaming, Global 09 is a good example of this. Inductive gaming was happy just to say, look, we're playing out the initial opening moves of a conflict between two peer-level competitors. And if we all get stuck, we basically get 3 days in and it becomes this attritional slogfest and we never get to later parts of the campaign, we're happy with that. That's fine. That's what we want to investigate. We're trying to see how well the opening moves actually play out. So we're not interested in having to fast forward past those parts if they turn out to be hard. Again, a design consideration and certainly a player expectation management part, because part of what we did with Global 09 was tell the other services, because these are typically joint games, look, this is what we're going to do. You may not want to send a whole lot of guys here because they're going to be disappointed if the operation doesn't advance to that part of the campaign plan that has a sizable footprint ashore, for example, in the case of the Army. So inductive versus deductive gaming is, again, another consideration in the design process, and is one way we describe games. Usually one of the big caveats we talk about inductive gaming is, can you afford the game to end early? What if red moves on move 2 out of a 5-turn game? Now what? It's Tuesday. We're going to play until Friday. Can your game design, can your players tolerate that type of outcome? Deductive versus inductive. The last little discriminator, we talk about seminar versus operational games. And this is kind of abused because of the term seminar. Remember I said earlier, seminar, an event for the purpose of interchanging information? A seminar game tends to look more like a discussion. No one's running around actually having a hat on that says, I'm the ops officer on USS Mississinewa. I am playing a role in an operational headquarters or staff. That's an operational game. People are actually playing the part of a particular warfighting role. And we're more interested in seeing what you do than necessarily what you're thinking and what you have to say. It's your actions that are speaking the loudest. Seminar games are usually more about getting player ideas out in the open and being able to talk through problems as opposed to acting out problems. Both have their utilizations, but what happens is there's a tendency to put together a seminar game but forget the game part, and it's purely a seminar for the purpose of the exchange of information. And there's no game engine, if you will, driving people into a competitive frenzy to help stimulate the discussion. You can do a seminar without having a seminar game embedded in it. You can do a seminar game, but it's in format going to look a lot like guys sitting around a table discussing things, only you've found some way to stimulate them in a competitive manner. So oftentimes what happens, and that's where the confusion comes in, is someone says, we're going to have a seminar war game, and you're watching it and you're going, where's the game? And it sounds like a great discussion. It's fascinating, but there's no game. Again, from the wargaming department's perspective, we're going to try to use gaming because we think there's power in gaming in finding things that weren't otherwise be exposed through just casual conversation, if you will. So the key takeaways from this first segment are that human decisions are at the heart of wargaming. If there's no human making a decision that is influencing his environment, changing his environment, which forces him to make new decisions, we're not terribly interested from a wargaming department perspective. Gaming can be used to address a wide range of issues, but you've got to be aware of where gaming's limitations are and what it can't do. And it's not always done very well. We've had wildly successful games. We've had games that have been less than satisfying. And in your time here in the wargaming department, you'll go to other people's games. Likewise, you'll see other games that are run fantastically, and you'll go to other games and go, wow, this is just a train wreck in disguise. But being able to recognize those and seeing the flaws makes the work we do here that much better, because hopefully in seeing someone else's mistake, we don't repeat it here. But the one kind of the bumper sticker, if you will, for this last section is that wargaming is about understanding possible consequences of decisions, not predicting the future. And with that, we'll conclude this lecture. Thank you.